So, due to popular demand, we're doing a second series on Jonah. Jonah is such an interesting book. And how do we kind of take all these kind of extraordinary things that happen in the book of Jonah? I think often we read the Bible and don't allow it to be creative. We want to make the Bible, everything happens exactly the way it is, but writers then also used hyperbole and exaggeration to get a point across, to tell a story, because they wanted, Heather, here you go, Heather, here you go. They wanted to entertain people and make it memorable. So there's a lot of exaggeration in the Bible that we too often take literally. It goes back to our discussion a few weeks ago on should we interpret the Bible literally? Yes, no, sometimes. So, being swallowed by a big fish and living to tell about it after 3 days in its stomach can be a bit hard to swallow. There's a lot of extraordinary things about Jonah's story. While we should consider the possibility of a miracle, we must beware of making a jump from what God could have done to what God actually did. Other extraordinary features of the Jonah story may help us better understand. I mentioned before, Jonah has all the animals in the whole city wearing sackcloth and repenting. Have you ever tried to put a burlap bag on a chicken? It's not easy, or a bull for that matter. It's dangerous. Also, it talks about how Nineveh had 120,000 children in the city. Well, that goes against any archaeological evidence that's ever been found about the city and its size. You have Jonah asking for forgiveness for himself, then he's not able to give it. There's all these extraordinary features of Jonah represent hyperbole or purposeful exaggerations. Hyperbole would have emphasized how even the worst of the world's wicked people stand ready to respond to the word of God, because that's kind of the point of Jonah. It ends with this question of, can you be okay with God's grace going to the people you dislike the most, who you think deserve it the least? As we talked about in the sermon, that's not how God works. But Jonah can't deal with that. He gets mad and says, God, you need to dislike all the people I dislike. How dare you extend grace to them? So they're kind of exaggerating the wickedness of the Ninevites, the Babylonians, to get emphasized, this is how God's grace works. Even to the worst of the worst, it's offered. And even they can hear it and respond. So it should give us all hope. But for Jonah, he just can't stomach it. Because he wants God to dislike the same people he dislikes. He wants some people to suffer. And if we're honest, a lot of us do too. I read an article, I'm kind of going off the sheet. You can read the sheet at home. I'm going to go off the sheet a little bit. This is a special Stephen side remarks. You only get it here. I dare you, if you're live or you're watching online. So I read this article yesterday by a guy who I did this Journey of Hope study with through this reconciling group from the UK that includes Iona and Corey Neal and all these places. So this guy runs this place called Global Immersion. He wrote an article, and in it, he quotes this other woman that says, an enemy is anyone who we cannot extend empathy to. And it made me kind of think. Because often we want to think of our enemies as those we have active conflict against, those that we dislike. And then it makes it seem like, well, they deserve to be our enemies. But an enemy is anyone who we can't extend empathy to. And suddenly that makes my list of enemies grow really large. Because it's easy for me not to be able to extend empathy. It happens all the time. Governments throughout history, and groups even now, they pick people that they think, who can we get away with marginalizing, creating laws against, scapegoating, that people won't all stand up and say, no, you can't do this. They pick those people who we can't really extend empathy to, because empathy isn't just understanding your pain. Empathy is finding common ground. It's caring, it's concern, and it's doing something about it. Feeling that connection, compassion, Compassion literally means suffering with. It's not, sorry. It's suffering with someone. And a lot of times we don't want to suffer with them because they don't have enough connection. Like, we'll let them suffer. They're too far removed from me. We have that happening to groups all throughout this country. So I'm going to Berlin in a few weeks. One of the reasons I'm going to Berlin is to learn more of the history. There's a book by a woman named Susan Neiman. It's all about learning from Germans, a history of race and evil, and how the Germans have kind of learned from their mistakes, how they remember things, but also how we go about learning from the past mistakes. One of the things is sometimes schools kind of get this idea of, like, what would you do if you were a German and the Holocaust was happening? Well, you do nothing. By that point, it's too late. 1942 is too late. There's not much the average person can do. When you need to do something is 1932, when things are starting to happen. So Germany is starting to kind of test the waters. Well, everybody's upset. Who can we blame for the disruption and downfall of our society? Well, we can do the Jews. So it's little things at first. Here's a mom. It's little things at first. Well, would anybody care if we kind of say they can't work the same jobs? They couldn't maybe hold government positions. If they need to maybe just kind of live over here. Maybe not let them play the same sport with other kids. Maybe not let them worship in the same way. Will anybody care enough? And as they see no one cares enough to really put up a stink, keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it until you realize we can wipe them out. No one cares. The German people were enemies of the Jews, not because they had a hostility towards them, but from the very beginning, they couldn't extend empathy. Same thing happens here. And so it's not to compare anything happening here to the Holocaust. That's several steps further. But is it 1930 here for anyone yet? Who can we not extend our empathy to? Those are our enemies. And that's really what the book of Jonah is getting at here, is can we let God's grace and our work be on behalf of all these different people that maybe are our enemies for a variety of reasons, even those we just can't extend empathy to? So we have these exaggerations, like way too many people in the city than archaeological things show, having animals wearing sackcloth, swallowed by a fish. But it's not just what's happening in the book. Are there exaggerations about God? Because it has God micromanaging a lot of the world. It has God controlling a storm, controlling fish, making a plant grow, making a wind come, making the sun beat hot, killing the plant. Is that how God works? See, what's funny is we get all caught up on was he really swallowed by a fish, but we never ask, does God micromanage everything like that? Because if God does, well, that can raise a lot of questions. Did God send the earthquake to kill all those people in Turkey and Syria? Did God send the flood in California, the hurricane in New Orleans or Florida, the wildfire that took the homes? Does God do all of that? Does God micromanage every piece of our life? We talked a lot about that last year in 11-minute lessons, about what is God's actual role in the world, and that God can do those things, but doesn't, because God limits God's own power so that we can be in free relationship with God. So we have freedom, because if we don't have freedom, there's no real love. Can you really love anyone who is your possession, who has no freedom of their own? Can they really ever love you? There's no freedom there. God limits God's self, God limits God's power, so we can have some semblance of freedom and the choice to live and to love. But that also causes problems because we don't always use that freedom well. But God chooses that identity. And yet Jonah exaggerates things. Again, the point is how God is pushing this question on Jonah. Can you allow my grace to go to the worst, who you think are the worst? And the problem is often we don't want to. We don't want to. And it's both conservative and progressive all the time. Both like to pretend they're on the moral high ground. Neither ever are. Little example. So, I have a really progressive pastor friend, and I was talking in one of my things about reconciliation and listening to others. And he's like, well, you can't listen to people who espouse hate. You can't give them a platform. This is like, Nazism or racism. You can't let them have that and legitimize it. I'm like, okay. But once if they think they can't give our speech about inclusion and things like that a space because we're going against the word of God or whatever it is, so they don't give us a platform. So now we both shut each other down and say, these are the worst of the worst. We can't listen to them. Where does that leave us? The thing is, we like to pretend to be holy or inclusive, but really we just talk about things differently, but we're still cordoning off people all the time. It's conservatives, it's progressives. And we have these cultural battles for things, trying to convince people God's grace doesn't extend to them. Your grace shouldn't extend to them. And then we don't ever get anywhere. It happened in Northern Ireland. And by the time people actually could sit down and talk and have any kind of empathy for one another, it was only because so many people had died. They're like, we should probably try something. There's been a whole lot of death. And the only thing that really brought healing was places like Corrymeela, who were able to get people together and listen and be able to say, I have empathy for you. I don't agree with your side, but I have empathy for the pain you've gone through. And I can begin to see why you felt you had to do this. And on the other side, I can see why you felt, but it took so long to get to that point. Because they had to, because they were dying. The question for us is, how can we do that before we all start dying? Because there are divisions, and there are calls for national divorce, calls for taking up arms against one another. There are groups who are excluded, laws being passed against them. You have more and more people trying to control education, either by let's push this ideology or let's ban this stuff. And it's both sides. But we don't have empathy for one another. And we create enemies. So my friend who wrote that article, he talked about, he's a guy who's been on the front lines of all these protests. Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ stuff. He gets arrested, shot with the non-lethal bullets. He's got all the shirts. He's very, progressive peace worker. And he, after all this time, he was just getting overwhelmed. He said he needed a break. He took his family camping. And he wanted some time away, but pulling up right next to their spot in the woods was a giant RV with all the bumper stickers of everything completely antithetical to everything he believes and does. And he's like, great. Trip ruined. They got all their flags and they got their guns out, and he's like, this is, no. But his daughter went right over there and befriended their kids, and they're off playing, and he's like, yeah, my daughter, making friends with everybody. And eventually they come over to him. He says, I wish I could say we were the ones that went and introduced ourselves, but they came over raving about his daughter. And they're kind of nervous. They've got the shirt on that's exactly opposite everything he believes. Long story short, the guy notices my friend Jared brought his bow up. And he's like, yeah, well, I'm trying to learn how to hunt elk. I thought I might practice. He's like, well, I brought my bow too. Perhaps we can practice together. And then said, you don't have enough firewood for this week. I brought a chainsaw. We can go collect wood together. Jared's like, okay. And eventually they kind of shoot their bows together. They get firewood. And they start striking up a friendship to the point where they exchange information. The guy says, hey, do you want me to teach you how to go elk hunting this fall? So they set up a time to meet and go hunting together. Two people who are on the exact opposite side of everything that's in our cultural roles of this country. They meet to hunt elk. They're around the fire one night, and the guy says, I spent some time looking you up online. All the things you've written, the things you've done. He's like, are you CIA, FBI? What is this? He's like, no, I'm a Christian peace worker. He talks about how his faith is why he does all these things, whether it's in Africa or India. He's gone all around the world on a peacekeeping message and trying to bring reconciliation. And the guy says, well, I'm a 3%er. Anybody familiar with what a 3%er is? So a 3%er is what white nationalist militia groups call themselves. It's based on the historical myth that only 3% of settlers in the U.S. during the time of the Revolutionary War were willing to take up arms against tyranny. So the same thing, only 3% today would be willing to take up arms and fight governmental tyranny and oppression. So these white nationalist militia groups consider themselves 3%ers. They will take up arms against the government or anybody else. So here's Jer, who is peace worker extraordinaire, Black Lives Matter, all these racial and sexual justice things, with a white supremacist in the woods. Can you get two more opposite people in the woods with weapons together? And the guy leans back, the glisten of his Colt revolver reflecting the firelight, says, is that going to be a problem for our friendship? Now, they didn't have a choice now. And a lot of people say, I can't be friends with someone like this. What will people say about me? It's legitimizing. I don't know about you, but I see all this cancel culture stuff, but it's like, if you sit next, I think it was Vince Vaughn or somebody, got in trouble for sitting next to somebody that people thought did a bad thing at a football game. It's like, can't have any connection. But Jer said, you know what, we might be one of the most unique friendships in the country today. And yeah, we have a lot of differences, and we don't believe the same things. But I think from our conversations, we both have a grounding in what we believe that causes us to do what we do. And maybe we can learn from one another and begin to have empathy for one another. So he says, I'm willing to try it if you are. And the guy says, yeah, let's do it. Those are the stories we need. They're scary, though. They're hard to do. But I think that's ultimately Jonah couldn't do. God's saying, here are these people that you don't like. I want you to offer them a chance to repent. And they repented, and you couldn't deal with that. And so he went off. We have that choice now. There are people we disagree with, people we think are ruining the country, and that we have no empathy towards, and we are creating enemies. We can keep going that way and end up like Northern Ireland. We can end up like a Berlin. Or we can do something in 1930 before it even gets to 1932. And that's why I'm going to Berlin. That's why I hope we learn when we take the church trip to Scotland and Islands. We do education classes before that. I'm going to bring in people like Jer and Patrick O'Toole, the former leader Corey Miller, to share things with that group and anybody else who wants to go. It's why I want to take the youth to a week in Corey Miller next summer, where they can learn about Northern Ireland and how they begin to have connections. Even though they still don't like each other, they still disagree on everything. Beginning to find empathy. Because ultimately, it's probably going to be the youth who are going to have to work on all these problems we've created and perpetuated these last generations. Because the sad reality is, we've always had people we can't share empathy towards, and we don't stand up for them. We think, it's so bad what happened in Germany. There's another interesting book about how Hitler learned to do what he did in Germany, studying America. Because we had done it so well by picking groups of people, scapegoating them, and systematically stripping them of rights and then their personhood. And so sometimes we get all high and mighty, like, we wouldn't let that happen here. We have a lot. Will we let it happen again? So think about, where are the people we don't have empathy for? Where are different groups trying to strip people of rights, of opportunities, of personhood? And even if you can't even imagine why those people believe what they do or live like they live, how can you begin to build empathy for them? Or are you content with letting them be enemies? And then if they're enemies, how does that reflect your faith? Questions, comments, snide remarks. Went way off the sheet, but you can read the sheet, and it was boring. What's that? Which book? The Hitler Running from America? I have it on my Kindle, but it's in my thing. I will tell you afterwards because I have it in my phone Kindle. I think it's like Hitler's American Blueprint or something like that. I'll get it to you. Other questions, Heather?
Compassion and empathy interchangeable, or does empathy infer more action? Or
I think they're similar. They're not completely the same. I need to work on like a really nice one-sentence definition of empathy. I don't have a good one. I need to make one. I do think empathy is, too often we think it's being able to put ourselves in people's shoes. I don't think that's it. One of the things that Susan Neiman in this book, Learning from Germans, talks like the director of the Buchenwald concentration camp, but he gets really on this idea of when schools try to make people pretend to be Jews or Germans during that time. I don't know if you ever had school when you were doing Anne Frank, had to wear all your clothes and pretend to get through the hallways without stuff. He says that doesn't actually help. What you need to do is figure out how you can investigate, using all the historical research and the primary sources we have, why people did what they did. Let them be investigators. I think with empathy, we think, well, if we don't have a similar experience, we can't have empathy. No. Sometimes you have to investigate and learn from to figure out why people are suffering, why they're feeling this way. Because there are some things I'm never going to understand. I don't know what it's like to be a woman in this country, or a black person in this country, or a Muslim in this country, or a trans person. I'm never going to have that experience. I struggle to understand depression because I bounce out of things. I can't get into that mode. But I can still have empathy by reading, by learning. One of the best things you can ever do to build empathy is to read. If you read to kids early on, having all these imaginative stories about different people in situations they'll never have, it builds moral imagination. And that's what you need to have for empathy, moral imagination, when you can imagine a little bit more of the situation, the life, investigate it. It's kind of like Stanislavski's magic if. Anybody ever take an acting class? So Stanislavski was like a Russian acting person. He said, the magic if. And make up some situation in your life that you could imagine having a similar reaction. So when you're playing a part and someone gets so mad, they are so angry in a situation, you're playing somebody who plants a pipe bomb in a church. For most of us, we're like, we would never do that. To play that part, you have to imagine what would bring me to do that. And I think for most people, if we're really honest with ourselves, you can always imagine something. Something. You don't want to go there because it might be dark. What would you do if someone was systematically stripping away every right of your child to the point where they were going to take them away and put them in jail cells, in cages, and you would never see them again? Would you imagine fighting back then? If they came for your kid with guns and were going to take them away, and you knew you wouldn't see them again, can you imagine running? Imagine fighting? What anger would you feel if you saw your children shot right in front of you and people laughing at you? Could you imagine then becoming a terrorist against that organization, that country? It's moral imagination. And it can take you to happy places. It can take you to dark places. But it can build empathy. And you can begin to say, maybe I judged the IRA too quickly because I didn't understand the situation they were in. Or maybe I judged the DUP party of Ireland a little too quickly. I didn't understand the situation they were in. I've judged the white nationalist groups too much. I don't understand their position and what they've been going through. I have misjudged what Black Lives Matter means in the marches because I haven't considered. I think all of us are guilty of one of those kind of things. And that's where I think stories like Jonah, that are exaggerated and fantastical in some ways, invite us in to imagine we're Jonah, and we're asked to go talk to the people we hate the most and say, God loves you. I don't want you to perish. Here's the right way. And then when they do it and God, everything can be happy, you would be able to celebrate that rather than they've hurt me too much. I wanted them to suffer. And the reality is most of us at some point have wanted some other group to suffer because of some taught slight, perceived slight, some misunderstanding, or some real slight. That's what Jonah invites us into. And we get so caught up in whales and did God send this wind, we miss the moral imagination. But maybe that's the blueprint to try to find reconciliation with so many diverse and challenging groups. On that bright and happy note, any other questions, comments? Yeah, Cheryl.
At what point do you think, I mean, I'm just thinking, I'll just use an example, Ukraine and Russia. I mean, at what point do you say what somebody's doing is really evil? It's beyond the I can have empathy. It's like truly evil.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you expect people in Ukraine to have empathy for? I mean,
Yes.
at some point, doesn't it just go beyond the I can have empathy, but that's still
Mm-hmm.
there's evil in the
Yeah,
world.
I get it.
You know,
That's the challenging, slippery slope, because if you can say Ukraine can do that, Russia can convince themselves Ukraine is just as evil. We can all convince ourselves everyone else is just as evil. So the only thing we can do is annihilate each other. Because there are people we can say are evil, and they're learning about us in different ways and saying we're evil. What the British did to the Germans in World War I was they're coming and they're killing Belgian babies and eating them. So we better come up and rise up against the Germans and destroy them for their monsters. Because the only way you can often get people to kill each other is to tell them they're evil and they're monsters. That has been countries' game. That's how German used the Jews. They actually fought a lot of what the British and the French did to demonize them, to then demonize the Jews. So it's always a slippery slope. Because you can say, well, they're too evil. They're beyond redemption. The test of the Christian is not the love of Jesus. It's being able to love Judas. You can still say this is wrong. Absolutely, unequivocally wrong. And I love you. Imagine if you have a child, they were a mass shooter at a school. That's real for a lot of parents. I haven't ever seen too many parents say, well, those kids deserved it. How do you love your child and still think there's hope and redemption while also saying, that was the worst thing you could do, and I won't stand for it? I think judgment, when you think about judgment, it's not about just consequences. It's about God loving us too much to let us keep doing what we're doing. It's like when your child comes home breaking curfew again, you finally go in there and say, I love you too much for you to let you keep doing this. Sometimes love is saying, we're not going to let you do this anymore. And you stop it. But you don't stop there. How do you help them heal and recover? And that's where we often leave people. We stop somebody, we put them in prison, then we're like, boom, you're gone. You wonder why people get worse. I was in South Africa. There was one prison. Like, if you go to it, you're going to be there for life. Because you either have to kill somebody in prison to get in this gang or do something else. Like, once you're there, you'll either be killed or you have to become worse. So you never get out. How does that help anybody? I think we learned that after World War I. We punished Germany so bad, they had so much hate for the rest of the world, it was easy for someone like Hitler to say, they all ruined us, and it was this group's fault too. Get behind me, I'll make Germany great again. So our despising, they were evil, they did this, even though it was pretty much a group effort of the world, punish them, worse happens. So yeah, there's bad, evil stuff. But if we can ever say they aren't worthy of love, it could easily be said of us. And who knows, 50 years from now, people may look back at us and realize, wow, they did some really horrible things that we think are perfectly fine right now. Are we beyond redemption? I love this story of the early Midrash of Judaism. There's a story of the angels after they wipe out the Egyptians when they're going through the Red Sea. They're like, God, we got them. We killed all the Egyptians. They were coming out to the Israelites. We swept the waters over them. We killed them all. And God's like, what have you done? Don't you know that they were my children too? And that's the story told by the Jewish rabbis about God and the Egyptians. That's what's so hard about Christianity. Christianity hasn't been tried and found wanting. It's been tried and found hard. So we can't go that far. But that's the only hope we have. If we can't, what hope does the world have? We'll all just say, no, they're too bad. I don't want anything to do with them. And I see it all the time. Christians, progressives, conservatives, like, I'm super inclusive, but I can't let this guy speak at our college because I can't give him a platform. Or the conservatives saying, we don't want any of these books in schools and might give kids the wrong ideas. Different ways of closing off people from learning and engaging, and both trying to always take the moral high ground, and both contributing to the problem and thinking they're doing the right thing. So it's not easy. But hopefully over the next couple of years with the anniversary, we're going to look more at reconciliation. We're going to do some of these classes, hear from people who've been on the front lines, see the places. And just like I did on my sabbatical, I'm going to be writing every day when I'm in Germany, reflections, ideas. My wife's going with me, who's smarter than me. So she's going to write stuff too for her history blog from a more historian framework. Because if I ever say anything smart about history, it's always me like repeating what she says, because she's always smarter than me. So if you're interested in some of this, find her blog, read it, and she'll be sharing the things we're learning as well as we're going all these places. All right, that was 30-minute lessons. Sorry about that.